America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
The Trump administration continues with its agenda to shape higher education in the United States. The president's plan is to exert increasing control over both public and private universities. This month alone, it asked 9 universities to sign a compact for academic excellence in higher education in exchange for more favorable access to federal funds. Out of the 9 universities, 4 rejected the proposal. Now, the document asks the schools to commit to the White House's vision on issues including admission, free speech, college affordability, and other topics. A vision communicated in both public speaking appearances as well as the number of executive orders and other memos issued since Trump retook office in January. Welcome to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton. My guest is Khalil Gibran Muhammad, a professor at Princeton University. Appreciate you joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks, Bruce.
So the Trump Compact is aimed at the, quote, proactive improvement of higher education for the betterment of the country, as he puts it. And there's this growing fear among student bodies nationwide that this is just the beginning, and there'll be, as Evan Bowman with the group Higher Education Labor United put it, escalation in this administration's continuous attacks on higher education. You share that concern?
I do. In fact, the Trump administration since January has targeted universities with various demands, including the punishing of faculty whose disciplines they perceive to be at odds with its agenda. For example, people working in women and gender studies, ethnic studies, African American studies have categorically been defined as forms of propaganda that encourage hating America. And of course, this is a frontal assault on academic freedom, and more dangerously, really a distortion, a huge distortion of the actual curricula that exists in those departments and the fact-based academic rigor with which those faculty engage their students.
You led me right into my next question, because these compacts that the universities are being asked to sign, a veiled attack, thinly veiled attack on academic freedom?
Well, we have to see the compact really as an escalation. As I just said, since January and accelerating in, say, March and April, the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, sent various letters to universities. Many people now know, of course, that Columbia University settled based on one of those letters, compromising its academic freedom. Brown University also settled, gave $50 million back to the university to open up a pipeline of federal grants. They gave up less of their academic freedom, but they did make some compromises when it came to protecting trans athletes and students on campus. And now Harvard University is in ongoing negotiations with a speculative price tag of about $500 million to give back to the university to open the pipeline of federal grants. So the compact essentially crystallizes these earlier deals in a way that would make a kind of formulaic blueprint for the rest of higher education to fall in line. And there's no question that the demands fundamentally cede independence of these universities back to the government with a kind of litmus test. Whatever the government thinks ought to be taught is what should be taught.
But now you have 4 universities that are flatly rejecting it. What's changed?
Well, I think, as is the case in the case of Harvard, they just pushed too far. The administration has found allies within higher education on a range of topics. For example, the accusation that these campuses are too, quote unquote, woke, that they've been hijacked by Marxist lunatics and leftist takeover of higher education. Remember, J.D. Vance a few years ago famously said, the vice president, that universities are the enemy. And so There has been some sense at universities that professors like me are not good for education. Now, I reject this claim categorically, but nevertheless, they have found some allies. The problem is that the administration has then taken license to say, you have to follow our management dictates. No international students, or very few. We get to tell you whether you have SAT or ACT requirements. We get to tell you how many students get access to financial aid on your campus. You have to attack what we perceive to be grade inflation. I mean, at some point, essentially, the federal government is running higher education. And that is the line that has encouraged 9 universities, I'm sorry, in this case, up to 6 universities to reject the compact.
So do you think the administration is going to see what it can get away with, whatever, demanding loyalty oaths, and at what cost? How far are they going to push the envelope?
I think they're going to keep pushing because this is a salient issue in public polls. Now, on one hand, a majority of Americans in more recent polls have said that higher education is a net positive value in America and generally support higher education maintaining a level of independence. But there is some softness in support for higher education, largely around the cost of an education, meaning that tuition is very high and there is concern that students are not getting a value proposition when it comes to paying for this. So I think the university is probably pushing up against the upper limits, drawing on public opinion surveys with respect to their attacks. And it seems to me that if we think about the No Kings rallies, I certainly saw both in news reportage as well as attending one myself, a lot of defense of higher education. I'm not sure how much longer they're going to be able to make these demands and have any version of public support behind them.
Their stated goal is academic excellence. Is this, to use a metaphor, a wolf in sheep's clothing? And what goal would they really achieve?
Well, look, the Trump administration has consistently used a language that most Americans support, defending freedom and liberty, safety, health, making America health again, as the Secretary of Human Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy Jr., often says. Except language here, as we know in authoritarian playbooks, is the coin of the realm. If you can convince people through propaganda that you are actually doing things in their best interest, then you might be able to get away with it. The problem here is that if we just take the issue of climate change and global warming, and I certainly imagine that Floridians, having experienced a number of hurricanes recently, the old predictive adage that, a hurricane 1 in 100 years is now down to 1 in 5 years for many parts of that state. Trump categorically calls the science of climate change a con job. And so you've got a scientific consensus rooted in higher education research and academic rigor pointing out the increase of carbon emissions around the world. And we have a current administration that treats it as fake news. This is a problem. And so we cannot allow the government to dictate what science tells us about how to deal with a catastrophic warming of the planet. This is just one example of the mismatch between the administration's goals and what actually happens in higher education.
You're also seeing it in the media. Look, they just went to the media and said, if you want to report on the Pentagon, then you've got to sign this dictate that you'll only report what we tell you. So it's not just in academia, it's not just with the environment, it's all over the place.
Bruce, I think that is such a timely and well-articulated example because it also demonstrates with Pete Hegseth, the secretary, claiming that people who want to have access in Pentagon press briefings have to essentially abide a list of restrictive demands, including seeking approval for whatever they're going to write, has demonstrated in this instance really the first collective resistance across the spectrum of media outlets, from Fox News to the Washington Post. This is a good sign. It's not a good sign that the current administration continues to pursue unconstitutional demands and constitutional overreach, but it is a good sign that in parts of this country, institutions are starting to push back.
It is a good sign, but clearly there is a dogma among a big section of the American public, and that's problematic.
I think that we have to recognize that democracy has always depended upon an educated citizenry, that the need to actually be able to think critically and independently is fundamental to a healthy, functioning democracy. And to some degree, what we find in an era of social media is that the ability to weaponize misinformation and disinformation, to call into question various forms of consensus around a range of topics like climate change, even the notion that a state like Florida has set up an alternative CDC because the current governor opposes the scientific findings of the current CDC, is a very, very, very scary development in our country. And partly it is a consequence of the way in which social media takes advantage of misinformation and encourages people to question good common sense.
And part of the problem is that people look to social media for news, and clearly what you see on social media is not news, but that's a whole different argument. And your salient point here is that the clearest attack on academic freedom consists in the demand to ensure that a broad spectrum of viewpoints within every field, department, school, and teaching unit that are judged appropriate. So the question here, when you look at what the administration is doing, is judged appropriate by whom, Khalil?
Well, that's exactly right. So again, the language here seems innocent and even worthy enough. Viewpoint diversity. We want our campuses to be able to be fruitful places of dialogue and exchange in the pursuit of knowledge, regardless of the popularity of the ideas being pursued. The problem here is that this administration makes clear in the compact and in public statements that what it really wants is not viewpoint diversity. What it really wants is more conservative ideals and ideas to have a place on campus, to live and breathe. For example, it is a fact that people are born what we call intersex, meaning that their bodies contain the elements of two different kinds of reproductive systems, male genitalia and female genitalia. That is just one biological example that this compact would ultimately restrict, which is to say that universities must teach that there are only two biological sexes. Well, that's just simply not true. Furthermore, the fact that people identify by gender, which is a social category, not a sex category, is itself a product of the constitutional right to freedom of expression. That this administration would essentially demand that universities police the gender identity or classes that would teach the fact that people have fought and struggled over various forms of gender expression is absurd. It is everything that we know to be anti-American based on the very Constitution that this administration claims to be in defense of.
Well, the Supreme Court's hearing a case right now when it comes to therapy and, gender issues. And it seems like they're going to get in the way of that on a more fundamental basis.
Well, I do worry that the higher education's attempt to use litigation to protect itself with this particular Supreme Court may not prevail. Listen, from where I sit, we have a number of states developing policies and practices that would enshrine a Christian worldview in our nation's classrooms. Now, again, there's a lot to be said for many of the founding fathers actually identifying as Christians, but what they put on paper fundamentally allowed for the freedom of religion. We seem to ignore this fact. I don't understand how it's possible that Americans can believe that somehow, other than what's in the Constitution, when it guarantees freedom of religion. And just as a quick lesson here, Bruce, the 13 colonies were founded across a broad spectrum of Christian ideas, from Catholicism to Calvinism to the Quakerism, meaning that in Europe, people were dying over various expressions of Christianity, which is why we ultimately had freedom of religion. That, of course, through jurisprudence and Supreme Court decisions, including protecting the right of Muslims to prayer and special foods in prison, has been extended over many centuries. As a consequence of this, we are not a nation that is a theology. This is not a religious state. And so the Supreme Court should abide by protections that will allow for various forms of religious expression that may also extend to protections amongst atheists and secularists, including their right to control their bodies and their own children.
And let's talk about where we came from. Let's talk about our history. Let's talk about our roots. Wasn't there a fight just a couple of short weeks ago last month when it came to the president talking about, taking issues about slavery and history out of the books and out of certain museums and things because he thought it reflected poorly on America?
Again, this is another form of controlling speech in America. Our Smithsonian system is the crown jewel of this country when it comes to telling the story of America. It makes up 21 museums and art centers. It has been around about 180 years. It is funded by the government and private funding, but it is set up to be independent of the government. Why should it be independent of the government? Because we understand, including the founding fathers themselves, that there will be great temptations among politicians to control even how we understand our own history in pursuit of power and absolute control over Americans. As a consequence, Trump's demand to audit various Smithsonian museums in anticipation of the nation's 250th anniversary is yet again another assault on free speech in this country. Those museums reflect the rigorous standards of professional curators and historians who have agreed upon narratives that tell the American past. And to be quite frank, a museum like the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, one of the newest, opened in 2016, tells a story of the struggle of Black people to overcome, fight against slavery, segregation, various other forms of systemic racism. We cannot tell the story of America's journey from slavery to a multiracial democracy without telling an unvarnished truth of our history. Well, it remains to be seen what version of that story the president and the administration will try to distort in anticipation of the 250th. But make no mistake about it, it is a dangerous, dangerous authoritarian overreach.
You alluded to your fight here a little while ago. With what's going on, what's the impact to what's happening today, to you as a university professor, to the students you teach, to the university system?
Well, listen, I have taught for 25 years, and I taught nearly a decade at Harvard University. I was there on October 7th in the classroom. And so I have been through this incredible transition that we are experiencing with respect to increasing scrutiny over what happens in our nation's classrooms. I can also tell you that not long after October 7th, when the president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay, was testifying along with two other university presidents, the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the president of MIT, or Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that hearing opened with Chairwoman Virginia Fox for the Committee of Education and Workforce Development. She read opening remarks, and in her opening remarks, she called out a class that I then was teaching on race and racism in the United States as a prime example of institutional hate and anti-Semitism in America. This was a baseless, libelous charge against the class that I teach and against me because Chairwoman Fox had no evidence whatsoever of what actually is on the curriculum, what is said in class, who is in class, or what the takeaways or significance of that course material actually is. And in fact, 2 units of that class focus on anti-Semitism in the United States and its impact on encouraging Nazis to borrow from the experience of segregation or Jim Crow in America to justify their attacks on Jews during the 1930s. That attack on me and other aspects of Harvard University has never been repudiated by that university, has never been subject to national scrutiny, but it is a witch hunt. It is a way to scare people into changing what they teach, to self-censorship, to obeying in advance of the possibility of being targeted. And this has not changed. It has only gotten worse.
Is much of America blind to reality?
I think many Americans are looking at different versions of reality. That is one problem, which may produce blindness. But I think there is something that is also very real, Bruce, that we have to come to terms with. I think we give too many excuses to too many Americans who understand that the Trump administration is no longer abiding the Constitution, who understand that the Trump administration is playing footsies with various white supremacist and neo-Nazis organizations in this country. When the Trump administration accuses the entire left of being a domestic terrorist organization because of criticisms of the speech of Charlie Kirk, who did say hateful things. Hard stop. That doesn't change that he did not deserve to die by an assassin's bullet a few weeks ago. But we have a right to criticize the man as he lived. Listen, we live in a country where someone like Martin Luther King, a so-called American hero today, who is one of the few people on the National Mall who wasn't a president, when there were efforts to enshrine his legacy as a national holiday, the Reagan administration, as well as various members of Congress, opposed Martin Luther King as someone who they defined as anti-American. So the point is that Martin Luther King's speech itself was what drove them to oppose the man. Then, of course, they've completely rewritten his legacy. I don't want to get too far off track here. I just want to say simply that a lot of Americans can see what is happening and they are okay with it. Because to some degree, what they are fighting against is a functioning democracy that might spell the end of certain ways in which Americans are trying to protect what they think deserves being protected, including, as in the state of Louisiana or Oklahoma, being able to teach the 10 Commandments as a requirement in every classroom. I mean, this is a regression in American society, not somehow holding up the true America.
Just the other day, you had Vice President J.D. Vance rationalizing some very hateful speech by some young Americans, saying, well, you know, what they said was, they didn't really mean it. It was hateful, Nazi-driven rhetoric. Yet he rationalized it in some way. I don't understand how the Vice President of the United States could do that.
It is breathtaking, and you're referring to the news that a extended messaging exchange amongst a group of people associated with young Republicans, which of course includes people into their 30s, said many things that were objectively racist, sexist, misogynistic, yes, objectively, as well as anti-Semitic, and you're right. The vice president, to essentially excuse this as youthful pranks and hijinks, only further demonstrates that we have an American public that is in on the joke. In on the joke. They are willing to wink, wink, nod, nod to that absurdity. When, of course, if I were to say something that was categorically not only false, but offensive to people, which, of course, I probably already said because that's the country we live in today. But if we were to hold this up to standards prior to the Trump administration or look at an international context for what's happening in America, we wouldn't be having this conversation, Bruce.
No, we wouldn't.
The vice president would, just as a matter of bipartisan commitment to unity, would say, hateful speech of this kind is never acceptable. And these young people are sophisticated and mature enough to know better. But again, I think a lot of people are in on the joke. I would say millions of people are in on the joke. And as long as they get away with it is as long as we're going to struggle in this country to find our way out of this problem.
Let me get back to academia. Khalil, aren't many American institutions excellent? Schools that you've mentioned by name, precisely because people trust each other and cooperate successfully without overregulation, unlike some European or Soviet institutions that are subject to constant assessments, whose bureaucracy constantly distract from research and teaching.
Well, you bring up a really great point, Chris, and really great point here, Bruce. And I will lift up the president of Princeton University, who has been an outspoken critic of the administration precisely because he understands and celebrates a nearly century-long relationship between the federal government and higher education, a relationship predicated on outsourcing the research and development needs of higher education to university researchers for the purposes of maximizing efficiency and talent. In other words, the federal government has certainly the capacity to do certain things, but not all things well. And of course, speaking in the context of a Republican state like Florida or a Republican administration that essentially has three branches of government, the world is turned upside down that I even have to make this argument that government should do what it does well and leave other entities to do what they do well. And that's exactly the nature of the relationship that produced some of the greatest scientific, technological innovations that the world has witnessed. And as a consequence of that, universities do receive significant federal grants based on competitive opportunities. The situation we face now is that a lot of talent is fleeing this country and going to China and to other parts of Europe and Asia for opportunities so that they can advance their research agendas. There's no question about it. We will lose ground. We've already lost longitudinal studies that depend on the accumulation of data over a long period of time, uninterrupted by catastrophe or government overreach. That research is gone, and it will not be reproducible anytime soon. We are looking at a downturn in America's competitiveness in every field of human endeavor, and most especially in science and technology.
You know, I mentioned at the start of this program, at least 4 of the universities rejected the compact. USC's interim president, Byung-Soo Kim, said, while the school recognizes the administration's trying to address issues in higher education, tying research benefits to the compact would over time undermine the same values of free inquiry and academic excellence that the compact seeks to promote. And he went on to say that other countries whose governments lack America's commitment to freedom and democracy have shown how academic excellence can suffer when shifting external priorities tilt the research playing field away from free competition, which I think is what you're talking about. Agree with that?
I do. And just to give a really concrete example, Bruce, so the USC president is describing a situation where if I am a signatory to this compact, if I've signed up my university, it may not be the case that my university has the most talented people to answer tough questions about how to solve for Alzheimer's or cancer or stem cell research that helps potentially to unlock some of the most enigmatic diseases and chronic illnesses that people all over the world face. In other words, the compact is definitionally anti-competitive. It gives preferential treatment, not on the basis of merit and a competition, but on the basis of loyalty to the government. So of course, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't, you don't have to have a PhD like I do to make sense of this. But again, this is about power and the pursuit of compliance and loyalty to this administration. And it is clear to me that this administration is not interested in solving these questions or pursuing greatness for this country, because it is anti-science at its core. It is also an administration that continues to be supported by people who deny the outcomes of the 2020 election. So baked into this administration is a commitment to deceit and propaganda that threatens all of higher education, no matter what the individual preferences of university leaders are.
When politics and power continues, there are those who say there is no argument that fundamentally the university system needs to change and needs to become more inward-looking. But they say the Trump compact is not the answer. That and more when Politics and Power continues. Welcome back to Politics and Power. Bruce Hamilton with Princeton University professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Khalil, the administration's losing court cases over free speech and visas for foreign students. Is the administration trying to entrap universities in a deal that effectively removes the protections of federal law and gives the administration arbitrary power over them?
Yeah, so let's just unpack a little bit of the context in which the administration has gone after international students. We have to remember that the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that roiled various campuses in the wake of the response to Israel's retaliatory attacks on Gaza in the wake of the October 7th Hamas terrorist attacks means that the administration currently has identified pro-Palestinian speech as against the so-called national security interests. So this essentially extends what has typically been a concern about foreign adversaries either entering the country or their behavior outside of the country to international students who, like one at Tufts University, simply wrote an opinion piece in the Tufts student newspaper, essentially calling into question the administration's response to those demonstrations. She was literally kidnapped and snatched off the street and held in detention. People also remember Mahmoud Khalil, a very prominent pro-Palestinian demonstrator at Columbia University, who spent weeks in a Louisiana federal detention facility, only to be released after a federal judge ruled in his favor, at least, that the university had no right to keep that person. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has consistently claimed that international students are not protected by the Constitution, that they're here at the mercy of the federal government. And this is a brand new interpretation, an unprecedented establishment of a kind of loyalty oath that really fundamentally changes the core liberal democratic values of this country. So the federal government under the Trump administration has absolutely transformed the very relationship of international students coming here, which of course means that many of those students will stay and give their talent to this country. So many students will now no longer come, and we will have a talent drain from those populations.
So you answered my question about what the danger in doing this is. Do you believe this exceeds the president's power?
Yes, the current administration it does not have constitutional rights that are not expressly articulated in the powers of the executive branch. Under the current interpretation of this administration, we've heard Russell Vought, who is the head of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, who was a principal author of Project 2025, essentially say that based on electoral outcomes, the president has maximum authority to essentially enforce the law. But the law cannot be made by the executive branch. And that's precisely what is happening in multiple domains. Let's not forget that the 10th Amendment essentially reserves to the states powers that are not expressly enumerated in the Constitution. We call this federalism. And in this case, even considering the deployment of National Guard troops around the country, when governors of those states, for whom are the principal commanders in chief over the National Guard, have objected and said, we are not asking for federal help. And yet this government is insisting upon it. We have threats of evoking the Insurrection Act. So we could go on, Bruce, in terms of articulating the many ways in which this administration has not only broken precedent, but seemingly broken the law in a number of areas of American life.
Khalil, is there any argument that fundamentally colleges do need to change?
Good question. I do think colleges are too expensive. Mm-hmm. I do think that is the case. I think that universities will have to dedicate more resources to supporting students in career planning, to sweeten the value proposition of higher education. And it is true, even in my 25 years, the number of administrators who engage in various support role tasks, which are important, but maybe not always essential, has increased the cost of tuition. By the same token, I just think it's worth saying that some of the most expensive private universities in this country are also universities that provide free tuition for families that make less than $200,000, like MIT. I believe Harvard just announced this as well, and I'm pretty sure Princeton is the cutoff is either between $100,000 and $200,000. So while the sticker price is high, the cost of attending for those who have less income to attend is actually affordable, if not outright free in many instances. I am very torn about the argument that these campuses are too woke, and I'll tell you why. I represent, both as an individual and as a representative of a field of African American history, which is what I was trained in, and I currently teach in an African American Studies department, where for the vast majority of higher education, going back to Harvard in the 1680s, the first university, my experience, a representative of Black people, and my presence on campus, representative of an entire race, were not welcomed until the 20th century. And even then, in fits and starts. At best, we can say that beginning in the 1970s, Black people could find a reasonable place on campus and in the curriculum. The same is true for women, for white women of European descent. We're not welcomed in higher education for the vast majority of history. So it seems to me that we are still playing catch up when it comes to recognizing that the old curriculum of Western civilization had profound exclusions of entire groups of the world, entire groups of people. And it is only now that those people have more presence on campus, but we were never entirely there. For example, Harvard University has about 5% of its tenured faculty are Black. The same is true for Princeton University, which is about 6%. The vast majority of faculty are still overwhelmingly white and male. So the lies being told about the hijacking of higher education by these previously and historically marginalized populations is winning over people in ways that is breathtaking, but it is not true. And I would push back against it as I am now.
A couple of things here. I just read a report that women are leaving the workforce because women, like members of the Black population, have some of the similar problems. I think that, number one, DEI is totally misunderstood and has been from the get-go. Let me ask the same question I just asked you from a different context, because context, perspective, and focus are extremely important here. That's something that I, as a journalist, try and do. And I'm old school when it comes to journalism. Has higher education become, how do I put this, distant, inward-looking, and out of step? And is that frustrating here?
No, higher education has not become distant, inward, and out of step. If you just take the evidence of the internationalization of our campuses, which reflect people who come from all over the world. I used to teach a class where 56% of my students came from other countries. That not only has an impact on how American students learn from other people next to them whose lived experiences are very different from theirs, it also changes the way that I teach, because I have to connect with those students. I have to make analogies historically between things that happened in the United States and things that happened in other parts of the globe. That's good for everyone. It helped me learn my students better, for whom those students are, for the first time, are experiencing the United States. I remember teaching a class a few years ago. I had 8 Korean students who had never taken a U.S. history class. They were blown away by understanding this country for the first time in ways that helped them to even understand their own countries better. So no, our universities are not becoming more insular. They are actually becoming more global. And that's a good thing for the world that we live in.
I think the general takeaway here is that the Trump solution for universities, in your eyes and that of many, is a dangerous overreach that would irrevocably damage universities, the future of science, and the American economy, rather than revitalizing and strengthening them. So moving forward, do the universities themselves have to write the next chapter? And is academic freedom inseparable from the First Amendment?
Academic freedom is the First Amendment in action. I mean, in ways that our speech, yours and mine, Bruce, is protected in the public square. If we were to go and stand out on a street corner, we basically get to say what we want to say. People might want to do harm to us, and we might get picked up on a disorderly conduct charge, depending on how loudly we are speaking. But the Constitution, at least up till today, still protects that kind of speech. The problem is that most people who are adults work in workplaces where those protections don't extend. Most people in their private workplaces do not have full free speech rights. But guess what? If you work at a university, you do. If you are a student at a university, You do. Now, private universities can be a little bit more restrictive for the same reasons that private employers can. But by and large, those private universities, particularly the ones targeted by the Trump administration, have aligned their speech values to be consistent with the First Amendment because they recognize that free speech encourages truth seeking. The founding fathers and Enlightenment thinkers themselves believed that the only way to root out bad ideas was with more speech, not with censorship. And I can tell you, as a Black person, being exposed to racist speech in higher education and off campus is deeply troubling and hurtful at times. But I have never been part of any movement of mass censorship of anyone. In fact, I've never been part of any effort to censor someone who came to campus whose views I felt were either racist or sexist or just flat out wrong. I generally welcome such debates, and I encourage your listeners or viewers of this conversation to look up one I had with Glenn Lowry at Arizona State University a couple of years ago. There are way more people like me in higher education than any of the selective examples of intolerance that have been identified with either students or faculty as part of the so-called woke culture on campuses around the country.
And having talked with quite a few people in academia, I have heard the same thing. And they tell me there is a need for a new compact, but it's one that opens the door wider, that welcomes debate across ideological lines. That kind of institution, they say, is a healthy one, that a political institution's not.
No government should be in the business of running universities. What we would want, what Europeans figured out better than we did, was how to make college going more affordable, which means that there is a role for the federal government and state legislative bodies to support higher education, to support more people to attend college. But again, if we go back to the fundamentals of what sits and rests underneath the Trump administration's power, which is the MAGA movement, that movement is not interested in truth-seeking across the board. That movement has elements of it that are interested in a Christian Zionist America that will ultimately restrict liberty across the board, would give power to authoritarians to create loyalty oaths for Americans across all aspects of American life. And they've been clear about this. There is no question about it. So we have to decide in the face of this choice whether we want an America that remains a nation of laws with constitutional protections, where the very right to criticize government is, by definition, fundamental to what it means to be American, which is what we saw expressed in the No Kings marches? Or do we want to accept the argument of MAGA America that any criticism of this administration, at least, is anti-American and must be stopped at all costs?
So is the solution for the future a university system one that involves campuses where conservative, liberal, libertarian, progressive, religious, secular, urban, and rural perspectives can be aired and challenged without fear?
Yes, but that is already the case. And let me just say this. There is some survey evidence that people on campuses don't feel free to express their views either in the classroom or on campus. The problem with the very nature of the survey is anybody feels this way across the spectrum. Because I can have views as essentially a progressive African-American who makes people like, say, Seth Moulton, a Democrat in Boston, or a centrist Democrat like Chuck Schumer feel uncomfortable. So I might censor myself in the face of that kind of peer pressure. What we are denying here is that partisanship does not map easily into America's college classrooms. People don't raise their hand to speak or choose not to speak up because they're so-called Democrats or Republicans, because across many, many issues in American life, people can feel like their opinion is not one that is well embraced, and they might choose not to express their opinion. That has always been the case, and frankly, there is no solution to that because people do like social approval, and depending on the context in which social approval is being sought, they may choose to keep their mouths quiet. All we can do is affirm the value, and all we can do is make sure that our campuses are rich with a wide array of lived experiences, which will maximize opportunities for people from rural America or veterans or people who are first-generation immigrants. I teach a class right now where I have 2 students in an undergraduate class, one of whom is in his 30s, another of whom is a parent of a small child. That's the first time in my career that I've had students like that. And it's wonderful because they bring particular experiences to the classroom. This was not the case 25 years ago. And that is the challenge for following this administration's lead in changing what is already a good thing happening on our campuses.
One final question. You were named after the world-famous author and poet Khalil Gibran, who wrote one of my favorite books, The Prophet. And he wrote, "A wise teacher does not impose their own knowledge, but rather leads you to the threshold of your own mind." Apropos here?
Absolutely. What a wonderful, wonderful quote. Also one of my favorites, and lots of inspiration. And we should encourage people to read Khalil Gibran. What an incredible guide for times like these.
Khalil Gibran Muhammad, thank you for your time, for offering some interesting insights into a raging debate across America today. And for those of you watching, I thank you for your time. I certainly do encourage your response. Keep it courteous. We appreciate whatever response that you do have, as long as it's thoughtful and it's kind. Thank you for watching Politics and Power.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.